Now today we have 3 stories coming from the oldest intact area in the city of Richmond, Church Hill, which is located on the East End, a neighborhood with buildings that were built before the Civil War and are still standing as we speak. And as beautiful as Church Hill is today, there will always be a certain darkness lingering around, stemming from slavery, greed, drugs, poverty, and an unethical legal system. But before we can understand how the Church Hill today became what it was during the story's time period of the 80s, we gotta get to know the history behind this neighborhood from its origin.
We never really had a sound.
This is Melt the Mic right here. We're in the heart of Richmond, VA.
They got gangs, roaches.
Yes, it was the deadliest invasion since the Civil War.
Killers, dope.
Drug-related shootings in Richmond.
We knew what we couldn't do, so we were forced to be original.
If you ever wondered how this place got its name, it may surprise you that it originates 200 plus years in the past. Named after St. John's Episcopal Church, built the year 1741, considered the heart of the neighborhood. So along with the church's importance to the community, it also simply sat on a hill, which at the time earned the name Indian Hill, but also interchangeable with Richmond Hill. But in general, it was always recognized as it is today, Church Hill. There were several events that this community lived and survived through. The earliest being the Panic of 1819, the first financial crisis of the United States, causing Church Hill residents to lose homes and leave the area. But that was a paper cut compared to the hardships of slaves being sold in the Shockoe Bottom district just 3 minutes away. It's not unknown to us that this was a common practice during that period, but what most don't know, our city used to be the largest slave market in the Upper South, second largest to New Orleans in the South overall. We're talking thousands of black lives on average being transported through the same streets that we walk and drive today. And it would be 43 years later before anything would change. By 1865, it's the beginning of the end for slavery. Union soldiers from the North had the city in a chokehold. Several homes in Church Hill were converted into hospitals for Confederate soldiers, and the neighborhood itself would avoid being totally destroyed, while other parts of the city were rioting, looting, and burning down. So as the smoke cleared, the last documented slave sale in the city occurred at the end of that year. Huge groups of our freed ancestors were out celebrating on the streets, organizing parades and special events just to mark the occasion. As we break into the 1900s, that meant the development of Church Hill North, which became a neighborhood of the middle class, made up of mostly tradesmen who owned their own homes. But they wouldn't officially divide until the mid-1930s, with Church Hill North being filled with the row houses that you see today. And Church Hill itself, they would still thrive. But 20 years later, going into the 1950s, we see the first sign of this community on a decline, with many saying that Church Hill was transforming into a slum, especially with the popularity of heroin being on the rise. Next came the influx of working class black Americans, which led to one of the largest white flights in the region. But it wasn't surprising. Racism was just as normal as watching TV in the afternoon. You don't think about it. It wasn't innate, but it was definitely second nature. But because Church Hill had been so close to the center of Richmond's activity, it suffered when that center, mostly whites, moved over to the West End, attracted to the trolley and automobile accessible suburbs that developed in those areas, taking its consumers and economic power along with it. Population dropping from over 4,500 in 1960 to less than 2,000 by 1980. One of the worst periods in history for any inner city. But Richmond, like most small towns, wouldn't see it coming, because in the 1970s, Richmond's murder rate overall had decreased, but the number of murders in the Church Hill neighborhood specifically, it had doubled. Rapes would triple. And you follow that up with the occasional serial killer or two, and you've now created the perfect recipe for a house of horrors. With everything Church Hill has endured throughout its history, it would now have to face one of the biggest challenges yet, with the crack epidemic, prompting a decades-long war on drugs that birthed some of the worst that the city of Richmond had to offer. It's 1981, and we're far removed from the beautiful row house community that we come to know and love. And here was a guy, highly considered to be a product of his environment, named Charles Edward Benz. Born and raised in Richmond, he had always lived with his mother, sisters, and brother inside a house on 35th Street before moving to Mosby Court as a child. By age 16, he was a high school dropout, leaving his mother's home to live with a 27-year-old woman in Church Hill. So essentially, he was out in the world to fend for himself. Now, Charles kicked off his criminal career very early, but on this day, he had a partner in crime named Bobby Patterson, referring to one another as friends, not knowing the loyalty of said friendship would be tested in a real way. They went out, prowling the streets for a lick, and they struck. But after a day or so, they were caught and arrested. Because of their ages, they weren't looking at much time or any at all for that matter. Yet and still, they fought the charges and ended up at trial in juvenile court. Charles would take the stand to testify against his friend, and Bobby was in total disbelief over the situation. After it all, Bobby was convicted of the robbery charge and placed on probation. Didn't mean his friend Charles hadn't just committed a capital offense in terms of the code of the streets. There's no word on what happened next, just that the two teens had moved on with their own lives. Over a year later, on April 28th of 1982, 19-year-old Bobby was shooting dice on the porch of a house in the Mosby Court projects. In the midst of playing, Bobby spotted Charles among the large number of people who were lingering around. Not giving it a second thought, he would abruptly leave the game, along with the $1,700 he won stuffed inside his pocket. And it was about 9 p.m. when he made his way home, which was located in Highland Park. And unbeknownst to Bobby, Charles had been following him the entire time. Once Bobby got up to an alleyway on Raven Street, that would be the moment Charles caught up with him. And with his weapon in hand, he shoots Bobby once in the ribs and once in the hip. Now, Charles wouldn't see any direct consequences from robbing his former friend, but it would come back around full circle just a year later. It's February 17th, 1983, and today was the day that Charles and a friend of his named Robert Good would put a plan into motion. Robert was now an employee at a grocery store off the 2600 block of East Broad Street. While still planning to go to work that day, he would leave his job later on and pick up Charles and take him to the restaurant in Church Hill. Meanwhile, a 29-year-old man from Midlothian, Virginia named Robert Davis was out making deliveries like normal. He worked for Brown Distribution, and he himself would also be heading to that same restaurant in Church Hill. Davis pulls up to North 31st East Marshall Street. He enters the restaurant with his delivery like numerous times before. He was then paid $237 for the order and intended on making way to his next stop. But by now, Robert had already picked up Charles and was sitting outside the restaurant when Davis exited the building. Charles had been using heroin and drinking alcohol when he was picked up, so upon exiting that car, he was all over the place. Robert pulled off and parked a block away, keeping the engine running for a quick getaway. And while rushing him outside the restaurant, pistol in hand, he says to him, "This is a robbery." But Davis, he fought back. He grabbed Charles and was now struggling for the gun. And with that, plus Charles being intoxicated, he panicked, prompting him to mistakenly fire 2 shots into David. One bullet passing through Davis's pants leg and the other struck David in the face. Both would then stumble over each other before Charles jolts up off the ground and shot. He abandoned the robbery, then fled back to the car with his friend Robert. Davis, he was the second delivery man shot to death in February of 1983, the first being a 21-year-old man named Paul LaSalle, who worked for Cliff Wheel Vending Service, and for his death, no arrests were yet to be made. After fleeing the scene, Robert dropped Charles off at his mother's home in Mosby Court Projects. Charles went inside the apartment and turned on some music to listen to, drowning out his thoughts about what he's done, thinking he had just lost his cool and killed a Budweiser delivery man. He hadn't intended to commit that murder, only to rob the beer man, as he did to many others before. Just 15 minutes after killing him, he confessed to his brother-in-law named Sylvester, telling him, and I quote, "I'm not going to tell on myself. I'd be a fool to do that." Sometime later, Sylvester secretly tape recorded his admission, and not long after, Charles and Robert had been arrested. Sylvester would later go on into protective custody until his brother-in-law's trial date. Sylvester would say from the stand that he contacted police because he felt that the murder was wrong and he wanted to help Charles the best way he could. But his brother wouldn't be the only one to switch sides on him, because detectives would spend days, weeks, all in efforts to get Charles to testify against Robert, but to no avail. He stayed silent, this time, that is. And they did this because there was a lack of evidence against his accomplice, Robert Good. So authorities had no choice but to offer Robert the deal. It was in order to convict the man who actually performed the robbery and the shooting. But the deal came along with Robert Good himself testifying against his friend, and he agreed. so Robert would only be found guilty of being an accessory after the fact to murder, eventually being sentenced to 12 months in jail with 6 months suspended and a plea agreement he worked out with prosecutors, which is the very deja vu moment of this story, because just as he took the stand on his friend as a juvenile, his supposed friend would do to him the same way today. Charles was then sentenced to 54 years in prison, with 4 years suspended. The judge took into account of Charles' age in his guilty plea, but that incident that we spoke about earlier, the one that came back to bite him, would show his face in the courtroom, because along with his 54 years for murder, Charles received an additional 20-year sentence on the conviction of shooting and robbing his other former friend last year. And the jury, they returned their guilty verdicts after about 2 hours of deliberation. Now his attorney, Charles Cosby, he agrees it was a tragedy, but it's even more tragedy because it was committed by a 17-year-old who was presumably just starting out in life. In a nutshell, Your Honor, this is a very senseless and meaningless act. And some of Charles's last words were this: "I was high. I didn't really know what I was doing. I'd like to be dead instead of Davis." Davis's wife, during an interview about the ordeal, would describe what it was like to lose her husband by saying, "Can you imagine what it's like to suddenly and without warning have your whole world destroyed? To have your hopes and dreams for the future shattered? To have the most important thing in your life taken away from you?" Davis's wife got some good news about a loan that the couple had been seeking to build a new home. Turns out, the loan had been approved the day after her husband was murdered. After the first year of prison, life passed for Charles, who was incarcerated at the Mecklenburg Correctional Center. He was put into segregation custody. Reason being, not long after arriving, he stabbed a fellow inmate to death. Through the years of 1984 and 85, it was more than one reason to be terrified of walking the streets on the east end of Richmond. Many of our elders and older family members have told us the stories, shown us the war wounds, and still dealt with the psychological struggle that came with it, some more than others. But let the numbers tell it. Crime had dropped in all categories up to 8 to 9% each, a stat sheet that city officials like to toss around as if it changed how safe and secure the community felt, because people like Tammy Agee wasn't safe at all. A story about a 15-year-old girl living in a group home in Churchill. She was mentally handicapped, which made her an easy victim. She would be beaten, raped, tied to a tree, then left for dead, forecasting a strange feeling in the air that wasn't felt since a guy named Timothy Spencer roamed the streets. A serial killer dubbed the Southside Strangler, who in a few years from now would terrorize the city in 1987. But there were other individuals who'd avoid the limelight, the Netflix specials in their name, or future documentaries about the murders they committed. And this was due to them either being captured or killed before reaching a body count that would even consider them serial killers. Now by the year of 1986, there were efforts to restore homes and bring about change to the neighborhood, while some areas were in the worst of conditions. The city even sold a few dilapidated houses for just $1. In all, 82 people were killed that year, and Churchill was putting up double digits.
Nothing represents a heavier drag on our productivity than drugs and crime. Drug abuse destroys families, it keeps young people from getting the education they need, and means that tens of thousands of adults are often absent from the workplace, are demoralized and sick at heart. Let's win our crusades against drugs and crime, because a productive America is an America that's kicked the habit and put criminals behind bars where they belong.
It's November 5th, one day after Democrats regained control of both chambers of Congress, which should be considered a win for most minorities in America. Now is the time for change, they may say. But the inner workings of the government were last on the list of worries to those in poverty. And not because they couldn't understand it. The stress of everyday life alone made it feel as if the government wouldn't understand it, even if they wanted to. So regardless of who's commander-in-chief, soldiers were still soldiers. All those moving parts at the top would affect no change at the bottom. So this day in Churchill was always going to be a regular day in Churchill. There was this 17-year-old boy named Anthony Tyrone Talley, and he was knee-deep into a dice game, eventually winning $15 and a handful of volume. Now after the game, Tyrone would meet with a man by the name of Rock. They were also joined by another friend of Tyrone's named Lawrence Roosevelt McWilliams, and all together they'd go back to Lawrence's house to drink beer and smoke weed. Tyrone, taking his partying a little further, would chase it down with the 7 doses of Valium he won. By time winds down to later in the evening, Tyrone will float the idea of robbing someone who didn't live too far away, but never revealed his true intentions on what would actually happen, because Lawrence had no idea that anyone would turn up dead. The trio made way to a home off of 1700 North 24th Street, the home of the Beverleys, a retired 74-year-old Agnes Beverly and 60-year-old Elsie Beverly, who was a Federal Reserve Bank employee. Lawrence would knock, and Mr. Beverly comes to answer, having a brief discussion at the door. Now apparently there were words that either frightened Mr. Beverly or he was simply getting a bad feeling from the three, so he would attempt to slam the door, but Lawrence, who's armed with a .38 caliber pistol, fires a shot into his thigh. Tyrone and Lawrence then burst into the home as Mr. Beverly stumbles over to the floor. His wife would hear the gunfire and come to his aid in tears, prompting Lawrence to then shoot her once as well. But both wounds for the elderly couple were non-fatal. Tyrone, who stood aside Lawrence, was armed as well with the .22 caliber, and the third man, Rock, would allegedly tell Tyrone to kill the couple, but he refused. So Rock, now agitated, snatched the pistol from Tyrone's hands and proceeded to finish him off, killing them both in the interest of their home, then taking whatever they wanted or needed from the house. As the night goes on, the Beverleys wasn't their last stop, because just a 3-minute drive away on 702 Roger Street, they'd end up at the home of 65-year-old Mrs. Smyers, a maintenance worker at Thomas Jefferson High School at the time. Now Mrs. Smyers, she knew Lawrence's grandmother who lived across the street, which over time made Lawrence well acquainted with Mrs. Smyers' grandson, so it wasn't out of the norm for him to come by unannounced. Upon knocking at the door, Miss Smyers opens up to greet the two. Lawrence would say he was there to pick up some eyeglasses from her grandson, who wasn't there that night, and still, she welcomed them inside. And inside the home, the mood took a drastic turn. Lawrence would disguise his demands for the glasses as a way to rob her. So as Lawrence took Miss Smyers to the bedroom, Tyrone went into the kitchen for a cup of water and waited for Lawrence. Appearing to take a while, Tyrone soon went to the room where Lawrence held his .38 to the woman's head, and Tyrone in unison would then show his .22. Now it's unknown on exactly when it would happen, but apparently robbing the woman wouldn't be enough. All the boys were heavily intoxicated and fresh off the rush of a recent kill, so at some point, one or all of the boys would rape the 65-year-old woman. Miss Smyers sat inside a chair in the bedroom, crying, terrified, begging Lawrence to not let anyone hurt her while he rummaged through her dresser drawer, finding a rolled up sock with money inside. The rest of the house was also ransacked, and after the deed was done, the supposed third partner in crime, Rock, would again take the gun from Tyrone, shooting Miss Smyers several times, but she was still alive, crying hysterically. Then Lawrence, he would deliver those fatal wounds with her being shot 8 times in total. Now eventually, Lawrence, Rock, and Tyrone all went home. Because of all the drugs and alcohol in Tyrone's system, he was dead asleep soon after lying down. When he awoke the next morning, he met up with Lawrence to have a talk, feeling like it was all a bad dream, saying that he hoped talking to Lawrence would help him remember what had took place. Close to a week after the murders, police would pick up both Tyrone and Lawrence. Upon cuffing Tyrone and patting him down, they'd find the .22 caliber murder weapon tucked in his front pocket. They were taken down to the station for questioning, and it didn't take long for both of them to confess. Now, most detectives would probably agree that along with the evidence already gathered, and now finding the exact weapon used in the killings, even without the confession, this was a slam dunk case. But it was the why of it all. What could make someone do something this cold and heartless? So he and Lawrence confessed to shooting all 3 victims, but Tyrone blamed their actual deaths on a man he first described as just a killer. But later in the trial, Tyrone would officially identify this killer as Basil McAllister, aka Rock. Now, from the very beginning of this story, the following events that I've described to you was the words of Tyrone himself while at trial, and all details of the events were factual, but one, and that was Rock actually being there to begin with. Turns out a third man was never there. Tyrone's testimony about the third person didn't coincide with Lawrence's statement either, because at the end of his 90-minute statement to police, Lawrence would say there were actually 4 people involved, but it would all be brought to light after detectives did their homework, finding out that the man known as Basil Rock McAllister had been arrested 5 days before the murders on October 31st, Halloween Day. and that was for violating his probation on a grand larceny conviction, and he remained in jail until May 21st of the following year. Tyrone tried saving face by saying he didn't tell his lawyers about the man because he knew what kind of guy he was, saying, and I quote, "He's a killer. I fear for the safety of my mother and my brother, and it wasn't until about Friday that the Lord told me to tell the truth." Now, a juvenile judge we all know from a previous story, Judge Arlen Ruby, who resided over Rakeem Cloyd's case, granted the defense's motion to appoint a psychiatrist to examine Tyrone. Tyrone was thought to be on the borderline of retardation, and after the examination, it was found out that Tyrone had an IQ level of below 78. But even so, the prosecutor for the state would say, and I quote, "Mr. Talley is as sound as a silver dollar," in disbelief that a possible mental disability was the sole reason behind the gruesome robbery and rape murders. In the end, Tyrone and Lawrence fully confessed to everything they did, with it truly coming out that they were the only two involved, and both will receive life sentences. As we venture off into the horrible events of the 1989 murder house, I want to warn you ahead of time that the names we'll speak on are very similar but not the same, so pay close attention to the upcoming details. Now, the history behind 2224 Jefferson Avenue is dark, but also normal in terms of the environment. Starting in April of '84, police would be called to this address more than a dozen times with reports of all types of criminal activity, with several women being sexually assaulted, distribution of weed, heroin, cocaine, and among others, and that in itself contributed to drug overdoses of multiple individuals. Aggravated assaults were seen as the norm, while attempted murder also reared its ugly face from time to time. There was a historical place called the Pojo's Pool Parlor, set a block away from the house, which on October 10th of '88, a man leaving the parlor would approach the Jefferson Avenue house, killing one man and wounding several others with a 9mm pistol. He would open fire through a window, aiming for someone who supposedly owed him money. Now, along with this place's already morbid reputation, murder would be added to the list. Now, let me take you to the day of January 6th of 1989. On this day, a rookie patrolman by the name of Lionel Jefferson will graduate from the police academy. The next day, a 24-year-old man named Lene Samuel Owens was out on a prowl between midnight and 4 a.m. looking for anything he can get into that may be of some value, and he spotted Lionel's personal car on the 1400 block of North 30th Street. Approaching the passenger door, he jimmied the lock to get inside. Now rummaging throughout the car, he would find a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, black leather gloves, and some pocket change. Then on that following morning, Lionel would notice his car door unlocked and slightly cracked, called it in afterward to report his weapon being stolen. But what he and others thought to be just a normal case of theft turned out to be the reason for a vengeful string of murders. A little over 2 weeks later, on January 25th, Lene Owens, who lived on the north side of town off the 1000 block of Hickory Street, he would start off this day drinking a 6-pack of beer around 9:30 a.m. Then by 1:30, he had a shot of scotch, chasing it down with several Valium, and snorted a small amount of cocaine, topping off his early day binge with even more beer. Afterward, he then make way to Churchill at the address 2224 Jefferson Avenue. Now, it wouldn't take long for Lene to arrive, as Churchill was only minutes away. But while on the way there, here was 22-year-old Henry Lee Mosley, considered deaf or mute, being murdered out on the south side. He had just finished dropping off a relative inside Jefferson Village, and while backing up his car, an unknown gunman fired at least 4 shots through the left side of his windshield, hitting him several times. The car continued to roll and came to a full stop after hitting a parked vehicle. Less than 20 minutes later, Richmond police got an urgent call from across the water in Churchill of a man shot down inside a home, the address being 2224 Jefferson Avenue, just off of Clay Street, which was the home that's formerly known today as the murder house. And just minutes after that, a call comes in about another victim outside the home, with dispatch hearing more shots being fired during the call. So in the process of Henry Mosley's death on the south side, Lene Owens was currently on a rampage inside the heart of Churchill, and it was all to settle a score. Before it all takes place, an elder woman, Mildred Jones, will be out on her porch waiting for a ride to bingo night. Lene walks by and speaks to Mildred, calling her grandma like every other day he came by. Lene was always around in Churchill, becoming a very familiar face in the neighborhood, so like Mildred, nobody could have seen it coming. After walking into the Jefferson Avenue home, he intended to speak with a 29-year-old man named Henry Ward. Inside this home lived 6 adults and 2 children, and the woman leasing the building was paying $240 a month in total. She rented rooms to others as well, which included 2 other men. Now Lene made way inside, and we can imagine he noticed how much of a disaster this place was. Total filth, wall-to-wall garbage everywhere. The building itself had a host of plumbing and mechanical problems, and among everything else that could have been wrong with it, Henry Ward, the man Lene had came to see, was inside his bedroom watching wrestling on TV. Something he and Lene did since they were kids. But this visit was far from being a social call, because after a brief argument between the two, Henry Ward with open hands smacked Lene in his face. Now feeling angry, embarrassed, and overall disrespected, Lene reaches for the .38, unloading on Henry right then and there, leaving gunshot wounds to his neck and the back of his head. Mildred, who's still out on the porch, would hear the gunfire, along with seeing Lene walking out seconds later. He didn't seem distraught, mad, or out of it. He almost acted as if nothing was wrong. But just a few feet away from the house, there stood a man named Michael Carr, who's also a friend to Henry Ward, the man that Lene had just murdered. So with no hesitation, Lene fired shots into this man's chest. He would later say in a statement to police, and I quote, "He was Michael's friend, so he had to die too." Lene would again walk away like everything was normal, with officers along with emergency services pulling up minutes later. They would first see Michael Carr stretched out on the sidewalk with what they described as large caliber gunshot wounds in his chest and back. Rescue workers began trying to resuscitate him, while others entered the house tending to Henry. Both victims were taken to MCV, where Michael died in the emergency room at about 6:30 p.m. Henry was undergoing treatment, including a brain scan later in the night, ultimately surviving with critical injuries. Now, it would be a full week before officers caught on to a suspect, saying they weren't getting much cooperation from potential witnesses. Few residents said they saw anything, and several said they didn't hear any gunshots. So Mildred, she would be the only eyewitness that identified Lene Owens. When they picked him up, he would give them a false name, but they were more than sure they had the right man. Back at police headquarters, Lene first denied shooting the 2 men, but then admitted it after. They found a .38 revolver in Lene's jacket pocket, and it later determined to be the same weapon stolen from a Richmond police officer just weeks before. He attempted to avoid consequences once more by saying he was intoxicated when he shot the 2 men and couldn't remember what he had told detectives when he was arrested. The judge didn't believe his story and would convict him of first-degree murder. Then later that day, he received a 56-year prison sentence. Now, if we remember, there was a murder totally unrelated to the Churchill murders, and that was the man who was deaf, killed in Jefferson Village. Well, in a crazy twist of events, about 9 months later in October, Henry Mosley Sr., the father of the deaf man, he would be shot in the face, killed instantly, on 2510 Y Street. This was after having an argument with another man over the cost and expenses for his son's funeral. Now, in light of this series of stories I just told, they were not intended to highlight Churchill as a bad place overall, because as it stands today, it's one of the more beautiful neighborhoods to stand in Richmond as a whole. But like those stories and hundreds more, they were forgotten. So in turn, the victims themselves were forgotten as well. But as a people of Richmond City, we make the city what it is today. So no matter who I am, how big this channel gets, I'll always be and remain a Richmond native. So shout out to Churchill of then, now, and the future. Rest in peace to the fallen, and y'all stay safe out there.